Aharei.
The Lord
Aharei Mot.
spoke to, the Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, who died when they drew too close to the presence of the Lord. They died much earlier, I think, several chapters back,
Yes, back
because
in
they
Shmini.
offered a alien fire to God. They weren't coming too close to him. They were. The explanation before was totally the opposite of this explanation.
I don't know if it's the opposite. It sounds a little different.
Okay, I accepted, but
yeah.
it is pretty different.
And what that tells me is that there was not unanimous understanding of what had happened. You get
So
two
it is
different
possibly
interpretations of what happened and why it happened right there in the text of the Torah.
And it's
To me,
a way, it's in a different place too. It's just
yeah,
like random.
And so to me, the message is don't be too sure. Because when in the explanation that is given, it isn't satisfactory to some people, all that means is maybe there's more than one interpretation to this. And he even says, Vayidom Aharon, and Aaron was silent back in Shmini, right? When all this happened, which is, you would expect him to say, this was terrible, this was too harsh, this was too that, it was wrong. And instead, Aaron is silent.
He doesn't want to get the same treatment.
Well, maybe he doesn't want to get the same treatment, but maybe also he just is willing to say, no, I don't understand this. I don't know why this happened.
Well, it's not something I have never ever noticed before, that this paragraph, if you take and you look at the end of the previous Parsha and the beginning of this one, it's a complete change of subject. And then you read about Aaron a little bit, and then it jumps right back into the purification story, which is where it left off. There's just this paragraph. It's almost like a cut and paste happened in error.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you have your class back now.
Yeah. Well, I'll see you guys later.
Very funny. That was good.
Just
well
closing
done.
the door because there's a big Israeli dance program going on next door. And, I figured that it might come into conflict with what we're doing. So here is the primary text for tonight. Very famous verse, and you'll see the standard interpretations of it and some interesting sidelines also. Then this Ushmartem et chukotai v'et mishpatai, you shall keep my laws and my rules. Asher yaseh otam ha'adam, which if a man do, or with, by the pursuit of which, vachai bahem, he will live by them. Ani Hashem, I am the Lord. Right? So just on the face of it, what does this verse seem to say? Anybody want to take a crack at it? You shall keep my laws and my rules, which if a man do, he shall live by them. I am God.
It's just a restatement of the covenant that we read over and over again.
Okay, that is one way to read this. Here's the you have all these conditions in the covenant, and if you want to live, you should keep them.
Well, it kind of looks like a different version of the Shema.
A different version of the Shema. Well,
Second
Yes,
paragraph.
Which
Second
part of the
paragraph.
Shema are you talking about, Jerry?
Not the first paragraph, second.
That v'haya'im shamoa, if you will hearken, if you will hear what God tells you to do, then, all sorts of good things will happen.
And if not,
not- Well, let me just say that occasionally the rabbis, when they look at something like this in the Torah, they will say, didn't we already learn that? So, Jerry, you have just said what is the primary critique of that interpretation, which is the Shema, the second paragraph of the Shema, already tells us that.
Yeah, but that's not the Exodus.
It's not what?
The Shema, where it comes from, is not from Leviticus. Right?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously Shema is in Deuteronomy and
Right.
this is in Leviticus,
Right.
but they are both in the Torah.
Correct. So for emphasis, they repeat it in different places, in different ways.
Because emphasis is good, repetition is a good way to emphasize things. Okay. Yeah, could be. The rabbis don't like that interpretation, at least not very often. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that they looked for other answers. Yes, Del, were you going to say something?
Well, read this way, it's behave yourself and you'll live. Don't behave yourself and you won't be long for this world.
You could be saying that, right?
And it could also be interpreted, if you don't behave yourself, you won't like your time in this world.
That's a very interesting and different interpretation. The Hayim Shamoa doesn't say necessarily, if you sin, you will die. It says, I mean, certain things, yeah, you might die, but it also it seems to say that you won't, things won't go very well for you.
Well, Rabbi,
Yes.
Just look at this last year. How many people that were locked up in their houses in terror from COVID would call what they were doing living? Subsisting, maybe. Living, no.
Well, or maybe getting by, and we're going to come to that, by the way, in the course of our discussion tonight, because sometimes all you can do is do your best to preserve life. And you may not call it living, but at least you have the prospect of doing something afterwards.
But the promise here is if we keep the laws and the rules, not only are we going to preserve life, but we're going to enjoy it.
Well, yeah, that's down the line here. Let's take a look first at Rashi's interpretation. Okay? He says, when it says man shall live, it means in the world to come.
Oh.
Right? Right? If you say, well, I'm just going to keep following the Torah and I'll keep living, right? But that's silly because we all know that everybody dies, right? So when it says man shall live, to insist on saying it's going to be in this world, Rashi and the Midrash on which Rashi bases himself here just cannot accept that. So for Rashi, And by the way, there are other passages where it talks about life referring to the world to come, life in the world to come. You may remember there's a passage in the Passover Haggadah attributed to Ben Zoma. Right? So, the days of your life refer to this world. All the days of your life refer to the world to come. Right? So, maybe. Right? Next, share with you one of my favorite commentators, Rabbi Isaiah Horwitz, the Shnei Luchot HaBrit. And he comments on the verse and says he will see that it is not that the duty of performing the mitzvot is just associated with his physical being, and that after he dies, everybody dies, he'll be freed from the burden. But rather he will perform the mitzvot with enthusiasm, with diligence. And he quotes the verse from the creation story, and man became a living soul, nefesh chaya. And what does that mean? Not just a bump on a log, but enthused and alert. Right? That's really what the covenant is about. The covenant is not just doing the mitzvot, but making an enthusiastic life out of them. One of the reasons, by the way, why Hasidic thinkers loved Shnei Luchot HaBrit, because they tried to infuse Judaism with joy at every opportunity, because they felt that that was what was missing in that period. There wasn't enough joy in Jewish life. So, maybe we should take a page out of Shnei Luchot HaBrit too. Right? Comments or questions here? All right, then. Yes, Del. You have to unmute, Del. I'm going to get T-shirts for everybody that say you have to unmute.
It's sort of like with the career. If you do what you enjoy, you'll not work a day in your life.
That's what they say.
If you enjoy the mitzvot, you'll have a good time.
Right. I want to tell you, it's not always true. I usually enjoyed my occupation, but sometimes, there were just things that went along with it that you don't necessarily enjoy. I did a lot of funerals. I don't think I was meant to enjoy that. It was part of the job, and it was an important part of the job because it gave meaning to a moment of passage. It was hard for people to get through that passage. But yeah, you should do Judaism for the most part joyfully, right? And if you can't find the joy in it, then maybe you need to do it in a different way. So hopefully that's something that everybody can take home. If there's a mitzvah that you really you don't enjoy, try to find a different way to do it. Right? Next, we have the Chofetz Chaim. Right? who says that the 248 limbs in the human body correspond to the 248 positive mitzvot in the Torah, which, by the way, that's an old rabbinic teaching. And each mitzvah gives physical and spiritual life to a particular organ. That's not so much part of the old teaching. If a person observed all of the mitzvot during his lifetime, then when he will be resurrected, all of his limbs will be intact. But if he failed to observe certain mitzvot, which correspond to minor organs, right? You say, well, that mitzvah is not so important. I can get away without that. So maybe he'll get away without his little finger. Right? He'll be lacking those organs, right? When he is resurrected. For example, what if he fails to put on tefillin each weekday? He might be lacking the arm where the tefillin should have been. Boy. And if the neglected mitzvah corresponds to a major organ, for instance, emunah, faith in God, which corresponds to the mind, then he's really in trouble because he's not worthy of being resurrected at all. So you want to live by them even in the world to, so that you will live even in the world to come. You don't want to be seen in the world to come as somebody who neglected part of the covenant. Right?
Rabbi,
Yes, Ronnie.
when they're talking about resurrection, they're talking about when the Meshiach comes, right?
Actually, resurrection and Mashiach are two separate things. They might happen at the same time, but not necessarily.
So what resurrection are they talking about?
The resurrection of the dead.
No, okay, I understand that, but when would this take place?
In the end of days.
The
See,
end
the
of days.
time of the Mashiach is not necessarily the end of time.
It's just, okay.
It's just, it's a good time. It's a really good time because a lot of the big problems of life are solved. Like, for instance, nobody knocks your kippah off if you're Jewish.
Mhm.
Right?
But when you think about this in the broader terms, I cannot think of a person, even the most righteous person, who has not failed in some way to perform.
Okay.
mitzvot.
That's fine. Right?
We're going to have a bunch of people without limbs.
Well, but not necessarily, because, sometimes you fail at something once, but you don't fail at it consistently.
Okay.
For instance, here talks about one who fails to put on tefillin. I don't think he's talking about somebody who missed a day.
Oh.
Right? You miss a day now and then, for whatever reason, you just didn't have a lot of energy that day, so you decided, I'll do it tomorrow. I did it yesterday, I did it the day before, I'll do it tomorrow. So that's not really ideal. That's not the right attitude. But, I don't think the Chafetz Chaim is saying that, here's somebody who, he's going to be shown up in the world to come as if he had never done it at all.
Okay.
It's just my sense of the Chafetz Chaim. Okay. Other comments or questions here? Okay. So here in this piece from the Talmud, hi, Barbara. The piece from the Talmud tells us, and this is the interpretation that's been made popular, right, relating to this verse. It tells us we are to live by the laws of the Torah and not die by them. I mean, obviously, you live by the laws of the Torah. It doesn't have to say you should live by them. If it's going to say you live by them, that's to emphasize something. And the Talmud says here, what it's trying to emphasize is you live by them, but not die by them. Meaning life takes precedence over almost every command. Right? And we'll see straight ahead what the exceptions are. Okay? And this is, this strangely enough is much more popular and well known than Rashi's interpretation of the verse. It's very unusual in that respect. Okay. Questions or comments? All right. Next piece. And all of this comes from one of Rabbi Joseph Telushkin's books. He says that with 3 exceptions, all Jewish laws are suspended when human life is at stake. Now, and all this is based on the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch and every other Jewish code. For example, while Jewish law traditionally forbids driving on the Sabbath, a Jew who would refuse to drive a very sick person to the hospital on the Sabbath would be violating Jewish law. Concerning the 3 exceptions, Jewish law teaches that death is preferable to violating the law. The most obvious case involves murder. If one can remain alive only by murdering an innocent person, better you should be willing to die. Likewise, one must not save one's life by performing acts of idolatry. For this reason, many medieval Jewish martyrs refused to be baptized and instead accepted execution. While contemporary Judaism has come to regard Christianity as non-idolatrous, the martyrs felt that forsaking Judaism to save their lives would be a betrayal of God and tantamount to idolatry, to which I would add, even Rashi didn't necessarily consider Christianity as idolatrous. And finally, the third case, Gilui Arayot, certain forbidden sexual relations, meaning incest and adultery. Thus, Talmudic law forbids men and women from incest or adultery, even if doing so would somehow help keep them alive. The laws regarding pikuach nefesh, preservation of life, reflect the very high value Judaism assigns to human life. But the exceptions also reveal that it does not always view life as the highest value. Okay? So now, it's occasionally said that life is the highest value in Judaism. It's not true.
Oh,
Okay. Comments here.
I heard that sometimes the Nazis would say, rape your sister or we'll kill you both.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And according to this rule, they should have died, but sometimes they did it.
Right.
And
Well,
I'm not going to blame them.
Listen, you know, I'm not here to render judgment on somebody's, you know, what somebody does under duress. You know, we're talking about extraordinary circumstances, and you know, you might not live up to the highest ideal in those situations. So, you know, but that doesn't mean that I necessarily want to say that you know, the person who did that is somehow not a good Jew. So maybe they didn't do the absolute best possible thing there, but who can blame them in certain circumstances? Okay. Yes, Daniel.
I don't know, honestly, don't know if I have this story exactly correct, but Maimonides, for a brief period of time, may have converted to Islam in order to survive and get the hell out of Spain.
Yes. Yes. So that kind of quote idolatry would certainly have been permitted, right? You know, if you are pretending to be a Muslim so that you can get through enemy territory and to a place where you can be safe and be Jewish. Now, whether that actually happened, historians debate. It's not clear, but it's a widely circulated, I want to use the word myth, but I don't want you to think because I use the word myth that it's not true. It might have been true. Okay.
Yes,
So thank
I
you for
prefaced it
bringing
with
that
I
up.
wasn't sure what the truth was,
Mhm.
but
And I don't think anybody is.
in Rabbi Telushkin's comment here, though, likewise, one must not save one's life by performing. You're saying that what Maimonides did wasn't one of the acts of idolatry that this applies to. Is that, do I have that correctly?
In this circumstance, if he had a way to get to safety, then what he did was permitted. Similarly, I don't think, Maimonides, of course, Maimonides lived much earlier than the Spanish Inquisition. So a lot of people in the Iberian Peninsula at certain points, they were under duress and they chose to accept conversion, but they certainly didn't mean to accept conversion. Rather, they were only doing it with the idea that, they could get to a safe haven, like the myth about Maimonides. Now, with Maimonides, he was dealing with Muslims, and there were in that period the Almohadim, who were a really ferocious sect of Islam, comparable to certain Islamists today, but certainly not mainstream Sunni Islam today. And of course, the Inquisition were dealing with Christians. But
No, I knew that, but he did convert. I don't, it's been a long time since I read his biography. He converted in order to leave Spain and go to Egypt. Is that not correct?
Yet to pass through a place where the Almohadim were prevailing. And, it wasn't just him, it was his entire family. And this was when Maimonides was young, right? So
You mean a teenager?
maybe even earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So even if he did, Islam is more monotheistic than, there's no Trinity, there's nobody but Allah. So
Right. It's not that they were saying that Islam was idolatry, but by the same rationale as people who wouldn't convert to Christianity, they felt that it would, converting to Islam would be a betrayal. This was a different set of circumstances. This was their plan for survival and to be able to maintain a Jewish life. Yes, Ronnie.
Okay, in the second paragraph, it says the preservation of life reflects the very high value Judaism assigns to human life. And you made the comment, but it is not, there's other things that are more important. Could you please elaborate?
Okay, so he gives the three examples here where, death is preferable to violating the law. One of them is murder. Somebody puts a gun to your head and says, you kill so-and-so or I kill you and you've got to do it right now. So the ideal is you don't do it. Why is your blood redder than the other person's? Right? Second case, idolatry.
Mhm.
Right? And third case, forbidden sexual relations, meaning not all forbidden relations, but incest and adultery.
Okay.
All right? Those are the three.
Right there in the same paragraph.
Yeah, I don't think you're okay. I may have misunderstood you. I understood that that there are exceptions.
Yeah.
When the preservation of life comes secondary.
Right.
But-
Those are the exceptions.
Correct. But in the broader sense, the preservation of life takes precedence over Shabbat, whatever might be the circumstance.
Correct.
Okay, I misunderstood you then.
Correct. And we're going to see that right here in the next piece from Maimonides, from the Mishnah Torah. And there's a second piece to this, which is very important. Maimonides writes, when one needs to violate Shabbat in order to save a life, one should not ask a Gentile adult or a Jewish child or slaves or women to do so. Maybe if somebody else did it, it would be permitted, but it should be done by leaders of the community and Torah scholars. If observing a Torah law leads one to allow a person to die, this would imply that God's laws bring vengeance or cruelty into the world. In other words, somebody says to me, Rabbi, I know you don't turn on lights on Shabbat, so here, let me do this for you. Now, if it has to be done for reasons that relate to pikuach nefesh, there's no reason why I shouldn't do it. And in fact, what Maimonides is saying is, I should do it. The Lubavitcher Rebbe should do it. If it needs to be done, and it needs to be done now, so the Shabbat law doesn't apply. And it's perfect, and it's not only acceptable, it's mandatory for any Jew to forget about Shabbat under those circumstances.
Okay.
Right? Yes, Ronnie.
Okay. Many, many years ago, when I was a classroom teacher, we had an outbreak of lice in the classroom. And we had some very religious families that refused to treat their home or their child because it would violate the Shabbat. And I thought, putting unnecessary suffering on a child just didn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
Why would they object if they could do it the next day or the day before? What are you
Right,
talking
but this would mean that the lice would spread and maybe another child would get it. And you know how lice can be very insidious. They refuse to treat the child or their house or their car because it would involve breaking the Shabbat. So that's not to save a life, it's to save someone from misery.
Yeah. So as far as lice are concerned, if it is a hazard in terms of spreading it even within the household, I don't see why they would not treat it.
They refuse to.
Yeah, well, No, they didn't read Maimonides, I guess. I don't know.
Maybe, but they said it would be.
Where
breaking
they would
the
say,
Sabbath.
well, Maimonides was talking about in order to save a life.
Right.
But I read the second part of Maimonides there too. That, if you allow people to think that God's laws bring vengeance or cruelty into the world, or disease for that matter,
Mhm.
right? Then that's a Chilul Hashem. That's a desecration of God's name. And we should avoid that if at all possible. Right? Now, some other rabbi probably has some other opinion, but he's a nudnik. As far as I'm concerned. Daniel.
It's not exactly the same spirit, but it's close. And I'm reminded of this Yiddish proverb that says something like, if you were going to eat treif meat, meaning pork, you should let the grease glisten from your beard.
Oof.
Yeah, I don't know.
Has nobody heard that, or did I didn't make it up. A
Yeah,
person who
you
spoke-
didn't make it up.
Helen
but-
Lassart, Ronnie, I think you know Helen, told me that.
Yeah, well, but you know what? What I find is that more often that sort of thing is quoted by people who enjoy bacon. And there's no law that's, yes, if you needed something that was not kosher because you needed it in order to save a life, there is no law that says you have to enjoy it. Yes, Del.
What my father told me that my great uncle always said was, if you're gonna eat treif, don't nibble at it. Take a good healthy bite.
Yeah, well, yeah, but you know what? That's for people who eat treif.
Yeah.
But I was also taught that during World War II, our soldiers, the only meat the government gave them was pork.
Mm.
And so it was eat the pork or do without food.
I'm not sure, because my father was groomed with the Jewish chaplain. And there was, food.
As an officer, your father got different treatment than the men in the field got.
but the chaplain made sure that people didn't have pork.
I heard
and that is something that commonly Jewish chaplains, at least, and many non-Jewish chaplains did for Jewish soldiers. It wasn't universal. I know that because I've heard those stories too.
I heard it, if you're going to eat pork, eat a belly full. But when I quoted that to a frum rabbi, he said, no, every bite counts as a separate sin.
Ooh.
All right.
I think the idea of mine was don't be a hypocrite. Don't pretend that you're this from Yid and then close the door and eat bacon. If you're going to do it, at least be honest about it. That's what I took from it.
Uh-huh. Moving right along. I want to go to this.
Moving right along.
To this second piece after Maimonides, which really is a commentary on it, from Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who just published this week. To ask someone not obligated to take the fall would imply we are looking for a technicality to minimize the violation of Shabbat. Such an approach truly belittles the weightiness of Shabbat observance. Actually, Shabbat laws remain sacrosanct, but the principle that the Torah laws are given to live by and not die by suspends them for the sake of saving a life. Important religious role models should step up and do the life-saving tasks on Shabbat to make clear the supremacy of life in Torah.
Mhm.
You know, there's a lot of things that are very hard to do, and there are leniencies that apply, not to let you sin, but, and I can't think of one right now, but it basically to make the mitzvah possible, because it's really impossible to do it according to the exact letter. So there's certain allowances that are generally made,
Yeah.
like cooking something ahead of time and eating it on Shabbat. You're not cooking on Shabbat, and,
Right.
and you kept it hot.
Right, but
And that's not hypocrisy. That's making it possible to do
no,
the mitzvah
but-
at all.
right, but this is about a different set of circumstances.
I know, but we brought up the subject of hypocrisy, and I wanted to emphasize that making it possible is not hypocrisy.
Yeah, okay, that fine. I have no argument there. But so according to Maimonides and Yitzhak Greenberg, I don't carry a cell phone on Shabbat, but if I had a cell phone on the bima and somebody is sick and we need a doctor or we need an ambulance, I'd be the first person to pick up the phone. There's no reason why I shouldn't, just because I keep Shabbat. Of course I keep Shabbat. But this is not inconsistent with keeping Shabbat, because this is of a higher order. Right? Other comments or questions here? All right, then. Yes, Ann.
The commandment not to commit murder is higher than the commandment, that it's higher than the life, okay? Life is not the highest value because
Right.
a higher value is not to murder.
Right. Your own life is not the highest value.
But the sin of murder is avoiding it is a higher value than staying alive.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, moving back in the direction of something that's been said before tonight, I share with you the teaching of the Sfat Emet, one of the great Hasidic teachers, who says on this verse, insofar as you put Torah and Mitzvote first, Torah gives you life in this world as well. Okay? So this is like another variation on this, the piece about celebration in the Shalah, right? Performing the mitzvot with enthusiasm. Right? So there's the Sfat Emet, who,
But
as a good Hasidic Rebbe, is also an advocate for joyful Torah.
But joyful Torah observance doesn't keep you alive. People die.
Sure.
I mean,
Sure.
we can have faith that everything happens for the best somehow in the long run, but it's not going to keep you alive in the short run.
Not necessarily, right. So fine. But I don't think he's necessarily talking about physical life. He's talking about the force of life, the what they frequently refer to as zrizut, as the enthusiasm that goes into a mitzvah.
So those who have enthusiasm have enthusiasm.
Well, that's, that doesn't say a whole lot, actually, does it? Right? So he's just saying that, one who has enthusiasm for the mitzvot gives life to the Torah and thereby gives life to himself. All right. Next piece from one of the great 20th century Israeli rabbis, Shmuel Avidor HaKohen, who talks about the fact that Aharei Mot is almost always read the same week as Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut. Now, this year, those were last week, right? But normally, this is correct. And he says, the Parsha reflects the dramatic opposites witnessed in the calendar. We know well that it opens Aharei Mot, after the death of the two sons of Aaron. And those deaths, which we were talking about before, remain inexplicable to this very day. But we also read of life. You shall keep my laws, my rules, by the pursuit of which man shall live. This verse has become a cornerstone of Judaism, from which we learn that the saving of a life takes precedence over the entire Torah. Thus, the Parsha has become an allusion to what we experience in the calendar, the fate of this nation of Israel. Every new accomplishment, every joy experienced seems to be inextricably connected to the fall of its children. Death and tears have too often been the painful refrain of Jewish history. But the opposite side of the pain is life, choosing and embracing life with fervor, that's the word I was trying to find before, zest and appreciation. The calendar reminds us that we must pause to reflect on these two aspects of the Jewish journey, and Torah powerfully echoes such a message in this week's Parsha. Comments or questions here? All right. Next, from the Kotzker Rebbe. Right? Whenever you know you're going to get a teaching from the Kotzker Rebbe, you're going to find something that's filled with fervor, and or it's a critique of religion that doesn't have fervor. He says, if you're going to live by them, if you really want to live by the mitzvot, what that means is that our lives should be full of passion. We must make an effort so that the mitzvot we fulfill are full of life and should be performed with excitement or fervor that shines the fire of holiness on those around us, and not, heaven forbid, that we should perform them as dead mitzvot, meaning performed by rote. Now, that's a frequent emphasis in Hasidic teaching, and no one was a more powerful advocate for that than the Kotzker. Comments or questions here? Yes, Daniel.
I'm sorry, hold on just a second. Let me get the thing right in front of me. I mean, to say this, it sounds perfectly, yes, that is a correct thing to say. The other side of it, though, is that for a lot of us, virtually all the time, we don't feel this fervor. So what would the Kotzker Rebbe tell us to do in order to feel that? Do we just act like we feel it? And, by doing that, we actually do feel it? It's not an easy.
Break on through to the other side. To quote Jim Morris.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Rabbi Jim Morris. Yeah.
Yeah.
Break on through to the other side. You would, do it until you do it with fervor.
Okay, so that's what the Kotzker would say.
That's what the Kotzker would say. In other words, do it until you find that, shall we say, altered state in which you feel that fervor. For the Kotzker, there was no other way.
No, I get it, but I can't. Why didn't God just make a mitzvah that says fake it till you make it.
Well, he didn't do that exactly, but he did say, v'samachta b'chagecha, you shall rejoice in your festivals, right? And that, that joy in general is a mitzvah, and that's the famous song of Rabbi Nachman, mitzvah gedola liot b'simcha, tamid. That, it's a great mitzvah to be joyful all the time. Now, why Rabbi Nachman said this, I don't know, because he was a terrible depressant. Maybe because he understood that he really needed to try hard to be joyful. It was a real effort for him.
It's in Fiddler on the Roof too. You remember that song? God
Okay, but
would
that's,
like us.
but Fiddler on the Roof is not the Torah.
No, it's not, but it excites it. He said, God would like us to be joyful even when our hearts lie floating on the floor.
Well, I don't remember that exact verse in the Torah, Ann.
It's not in the Torah.
Of
But
course it's not.
but
That's my
what,
point.
but
And
he's
neither is Fiddler on the Roof.
that
Hey,
doesn't,
look, Ann,
that doesn't mean it's
God
not
knows,
true.
I don't mean to criticize you because you know a lot of Torah and you can quote a lot of Torah. So don't think it's a big sin because you quoted Fiddler on the Roof. The problem is, for a lot of Jews, Fiddler on the Roof is like the only Torah they know.
But sometimes Fiddler on the Roof says things that mean the same thing as things in the Torah.
Well, even a stopped clock is right twice a day.
Ugh.
That particular thing is an important Jewish value.
It is an important Jewish value. It's not one of the biggest ones, maybe, but the Kotzker, I think he would say, when your heart is broken, let it be broken so that you can make it whole again. And then you go for joy. But obviously, there are times when joy is not the appropriate response. When when a loved one dies,
Heaven
okay?
forbid.
So yes, we say a bracha. We say, Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed be the judge of truth. Right?
I don't like that bracha.
And, there's another bracha for bad tidings in general. Baruch Hatov V'Hametiv. Blessed is God who is good and does good. Right? But it's not saying that what happened was good. It's saying, keep this in perspective because there is so much that is good in the world. That's why, Kaddish, people think it's a prayer about the dead. It has nothing to do with death. Kaddish praises God.
Right.
And it says, even when you are in your saddest moment, in the moment of deepest loss, you acknowledge God's gifts. Yeah. Duly noted, Daniel. So let me get quickly to the last two pieces here, and then I want to say something about the last one. Okay? So Degel Machaneh Ephraim, another one of the great Hasidic rabbis, notes that this word otam, you shall live by them, the root letters are Aleph, Taf, Mem, and they're an anagram for the word Aleph, Mem, Taf, Emet, truth. One who walks in the path of truth will indeed live by them, for truth is a characteristic associated with long life. Right? So I like that. It's maybe not the most important point in all of these, but it's a good one to remember. And then the last piece from yet another Hasidic Rebbe, the Netivot Shalom. he shall live by them and not die for them. Nevertheless, the rabbis have also taught that the words of Torah are sustained only by one who is willing to give his life and his essence for them. And without this, the Holy Torah cannot cleave to him. So, yeah, it's true that there are, you don't necessarily have to die for the words of Torah, but you have to be willing to go a long way for the sake of Torah. Okay? Now, I want to go back to the piece from Maimonides here. Okay? There are lots of Torah laws that are set aside, not just, violating Shabbat. All sorts of things are set aside when pikuach nefesh, preservation of life, is at stake. Right? Now, we all know that during this pandemic, there were ultra-Orthodox communities where people continued to learn and to pray in big groups and go to big Hasidic weddings, even though it led to more infections and more deaths. So my point, and the point of Maimonides and Yitzhak Greenberg following him, is that God is not so self-centered as to ask for these kinds of sacrifices. Giving up human lives for the sake of upholding God's honor and authority. And, God wants people to live more. Right? And, there are very few mitzvot that are worth dying for, but there are a lot that are worth living for and worth making a meaningful life out of them. And we have to keep those things in mind as well. Okay? We also, by the way, see this in the phrase in the Siddur, in the prayer at the end of the Amidah, Sim Shalom, Ki vior panecha natata lanu, that you have given us a Torah of life, Torah Chaim, and of loving kindness and righteousness and blessing and compassion, all of these things which increase life. And that's the essence of the way in which the rabbis and Maimonides especially have interpreted this verse. Okay? Live by them and not buy by them. All right. Thank you all very much. We will carry on next week.
Thank you, Rabbi. Shabbat shalom, everyone.
All right. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbos, thank you.
All right. Ashley, thank you.